Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so although the concept of selfhood or personal identity is not explicitly at play as a central concern in this Platonic dialogue in which we find the figure of Socrates standing in ultimately for the philosophical lifestyle, there is some important dimensions to be teased out. And so we'll talk about that today. And a lot of what we'll discuss when I begin the lecture on today's dialogue will be not very obvious, especially for those who are entirely unfamiliar with the practice and sort of discourse associated with philosophy as a discipline. So I will, as you'll see, emphasize predominantly just the first sort of moment or scene that we encounter in the courtroom, because there's a lot going on there beneath the surface that you may not have noticed. And so this will, more concretely or practically speaking, in terms of developing real skills, put you in a position as a reader to see the power of philosophy. Insofar as here we're engaging in a dialogue or conversation in which there is the span of some 2,300 years of distance, and we can still learn important timeless truths that are deeply and profoundly transformatively applicable to our everyday reality. And this might become somewhat clear to you if you took some time to read through that brief article that I labeled Philosophy in a Time of Crisis. And we might take a few minutes to look at that together. Okay, so are there any questions at all before we get started? I'm going to turn to the attendance real quick in a minute, but before I do, are there any pressing questions you want to ask? Not necessarily at this point about the material, just about the course in general. Maybe you took some more time to spend with the syllabus and the Moodle materials and a question came up. Is there anything like that? No? All right, well, feel free to jump in. So I am going to just open up the attendance real quick and move through that. So I'll just call your name. And if you're here, please just unmute yourself and shout out so I can mark you as present. And I'll have to periodically go back to the Zoom in case someone's in the waiting room. Okay. Let's see. Today is the 8th. Okay, Shannon, I saw you here already. So I marked you present. Michael Balbuena.
Here.
All right. Alanis Baldy. And again, if I mispronounce your name, I'm really trying to get it right and remember, so just let me know.
I'm here.
Okay. Elena Barajas.
I'm here.
Shane Blanco. Shane here? Okay. Kevin Burcham. Kevin? Okay. Nancy Cortez.
Here.
All right. Renee Croft.
Here.
Nicholas Espinoza.
Here.
Myra Escovel.
Here.
Victoria Estep. Okay. Jody Howard.
Here.
Spencer Howitson.
Here.
Max Johnson. Max. Okay, Renee Lockery.
Here.
Alejandra Lopez. Is Alejandra here? Okay. Madeline Moore.
Here.
Blake Morgan.
Here.
Kayla, I'm sorry, Nady.
90, I'm here.
Thank you. I guarantee, well, almost guarantee, I'll remember that for next time. 90, okay. Malika Quigley.
Malika here.
Malika, okay. Robert Running.
I'm here.
Michael Sachu,
Here.
Karina Schmidt,
Here.
Charles Tang,
Here.
Dylan Subota. Is Dylan here? Okay, Hannah Tucker,
I'm here.
Shay Van Butler,
Here.
and Patrick Whitco. Is Patrick here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, cool. All right. Nobody is clamoring in the waiting room to get in, so I'll submit the attendance. Okay, so how did you guys enjoy the reading? So how did you experience reading Plato? So Plato is the author, the figure, of course, at the center of the piece is Socrates, who's more or less as an important historical persona, synonymous with the discipline of philosophy. So I'm sure all of you have heard the name Socrates before, or if you're a fan of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, Socrates. But Socrates himself never committed any of his ideas to writing, and this isn't because he was illiterate or lazy, but rather because he had a particular understanding of the necessary methodology by which philosophy as such could be carried out, and it required active participatory conversation, dialogue. And this very point really connects in an important sense to the idea of personal identity or of individuality or of selfhood that we can kind of work to tease out of the discourse of the dialogue. And so the Apology is considered among the early dialogues of Plato, and scholars typically divide his overall oeuvre or creative output into three periods: the early, the middle, and the late. For this class, we'll have occasion to engage with one dialogue from the early, in this case, the Apology, and then after the midterm, so I think it's week 7, I'll have to take a look, it's week 7 or week 6, we're returning to Plato, we'll be reading an excerpt from the Republic, which is probably his most famous work, and some of you are already, I'm sure, familiar with elements of that at least, such as the Allegory of the Cave. That's from Plato's middle period. And what separates the middle period from the early is in the early period, we find the figure of Socrates in contexts where we can suppose that Plato as the author is giving us the Socratic persona as he really was and as he conducted inquiry in ancient Athens. So he's more or less faithful to Socrates and his ideas and arguments, and that's what characterizes the Apology. So we can understand this to be a more or less straightforward and accurate depiction of the real courtroom scene in which Socrates was tried. Although, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, there's quite a bit of subtlety, philosophical nuance involved, where some profound things about the nature of human being and of reality as such can be pulled out and interpreted. But in the middle period, such as we find in the Republic, we see Plato developing his own philosophical position, in the articulation of which, however, he still relies upon Socrates as his primary philosophical mouthpiece. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then in the later period, and we won't read any dialogues representing that, that area of Plato's work, that's where we see Plato starting to look back critically on his earlier contributions and to challenge his own philosophical perspective, his own metaphysics. And this paves the way for Plato's most famous student, Aristotle, to develop his own philosophy. So that's just something of historical consideration to keep in mind. So now I'll go back to the question that I posed. Does anyone want to just kind of share your preliminary thoughts on your experience of reading the dialogue? I'm going to put us into some breakout rooms so you can discuss the discussion forum prompts with your peers in just a moment. But does anyone want to jump in and share something about your experience with the reading? Anybody? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Renee, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say I enjoyed reading it, and it seems very unafraid of what might happen. You know, like the consequences of what could possibly happen from saying all of this. It seems very, this is me. I don't give a shit about the rest of you, and this is what I believe. And I thought that was very interesting reading through it.
Yeah, and he makes some kind of argument to justify that particular attitude in the court. Does anyone have a sense of what that view or argument is? So why, I mean, if we understand this, and I mentioned this at the close of class last time, if we understand the apology derived from the Greek apologia to mean defense, does it seem like Socrates as the defendant is really, concerned with exonerating himself? No, I mean, he's carrying on in the courtroom like a real dick. I mean, excuse the language. He's pretty inflammatory. He's provocative. He directly antagonizes those who brought the indictment against him. And just to make a few comments about the historical structure of Athenian legal practice. So an indictment that is a kind of charge, a legal charge or accusation could be leveled against a citizen, and that person would have to be brought to court in which they would defend themselves in the capacity of a kind of lawyer, using, as the Greeks call it, logos, which is a word that some of you might have heard before, perhaps in the context of like a communications course. But logos is a Greek word that has a very broad constellation of meaning. It can mean just word, it can mean paragraph, it can mean story, it can mean account, argument, explanation, and so forth. And so using logos as a kind of weapon, and specifically in the context of a courtroom setting, rhetorically as a weapon. And I mention that because a lot of what we'll be doing today and engaging with the dialogue is teasing out the difference between rhetoric as a kind of discourse and dialectic as a kind of discourse, which is essential for the practice of philosophy from a Socratic or Platonic point of view. And so I have some slides to work through, so you don't have to worry about writing those words down. You'll see them spelled out. But in Athenian society, you could develop quite a bit of power and wealth by achieving victories in the courtroom. And so that's why rhetoric was so highly prized as a practice or skill to be learned and developed. And there were these figures known as sophists, whom Socrates and Plato despised, but they were kind of traveling teachers who would go around and get paid by wealthy families in Athens and elsewhere in the Greek-speaking world to train their children in rhetoric, in the art and practice of rhetoric to achieve victory in these kinds of places. So that's why early in the dialogue, Socrates says, look, I'm out of place. He says, literally, I'm a stranger in the courtroom. This isn't my typical environment, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm using a mode of speech or discourse that's inappropriate for this particular context. So we'll talk about that too. But yeah, it seems like his aim in giving his presentation or making his defense is not exoneration. So that means it has to be something else, right? Okay, any other comments or any questions at all at this point? All right, so before I put you guys into some breakout rooms for a brief session, and then we'll engage with all the groups, and I'll ask at least one or two representatives of each group to share something that went on in your conversation. But before we do that, so we're all on the same page, I'm going to share the screen and walk us through the existential comic of the Apology, which maybe you've read already, but it's a pretty accurate depiction of the dialogue, a kind of nice summary of it that also plays with the ambiguity, the kind of equivocal sense of apology in English, just so we're on the same page. All right. Oh, I'm checking for something in the chat here. Oh, so Nancy, you had a question. That was like 10 minutes ago. The engaging reading is just commenting on the passage in regards to what we think it means or questions we have of it. Yeah, and so the idea is you're expected to do that twice with 2 different passages in the text. So if you find a part of the text that gives you difficulty, you don't understand what's going on, you might stop there, make a comment, ask a question about it. And I suggest that if you do that, at least try to answer your own question. Something like, well, is he saying this? And that will give me an opportunity to see where you're coming from in terms of the beginning of your interpretive act. So I can address it, and maybe others in the class, your peers can do so too. Does that answer your question, Renee? Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't Renee who asked, that was Nancy.
Yes, it does. Thank
Oh,
you.
all right, cool. And if you don't have a question, you might just comment like, oh, I really enjoyed this, or this is really important to me because, and then you can give some explanation. But really, in your passages and you're annotating the texts, try to avoid doing things like, oh, I really like this, and that's it. Or just repeating in your own words, slightly different from what you encountered in the reading itself, what they're saying. That's just kind of lazy and unproductive. So try not to do that sort of thing with the annotations. But okay. So let's just take some time to read through these panels. So let me know if I'm going too quickly as I move through them. So this is the apology, which again in Greek means defense, coming from apologia. All right, so there you have it. There's the apology in a nutshell. So I am, if there aren't any questions or comments about that, are there? Does anyone have a comment about the comic or question? I'm going to create the breakout rooms. Yeah, so I'm going to make, let's see, 5 breakout rooms. And so each room will have 4 participants. And so the expectation is for your conversation, I'll give you roughly 10 minutes or so, is to just work together through the prompts assigned for this week's discussion forum. And as a group, you can elect to focus on just 1 or maybe 2 or if you'd like, all of them, although that's not required. And then, as I said, when we get out of the breakout rooms, I'll ask for 1 or 2 representatives of each group just to share briefly something of interest that went on in your dialogue. Does that make sense? Any questions before I put you in these rooms? And I'm sure you're all already familiar with breakout rooms. Okay. All right, we'll give everyone just a moment or so to return. Just a few seconds and everyone should be back. Okay. So we're all back. I hope you guys had a good conversation. I've heard mixed impressions on the efficacy or value of these breakout rooms. Some people seem to like them, but oh, hold on a second. Sorry. Oh, you need.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Yeah. no- yeah. Sorry about that. A colleague was locked out of her office, so she needed my keys. But yeah, so I hope you guys had a good time in the breakout room. Some students seem to like them. Other times they don't work so well. But okay, so let's just take a little bit of time for each group to share some thoughts. So why don't we begin with room 1. Oh, thanks, Dan. So that was Hannah, Michael, Sacho, Renee, Lockery, and Shay. Would one of you just briefly share something that went on in your conversation? Anybody? All right, well, I'm just going to call on one of you then. And I will do that throughout this course. I want to make sure that this is a real intellectual community where everyone's participating. So Michael Sacho, do you want to share something that went on in your room?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about question 3. That is that death is nothing to be feared. So we found it to be somewhat not really persuasive, but more interesting because he talks about he gave like the reasoning of like its benefits, and he was so like interested in his own ideas and so like proud of himself that he kind of acted like it wasn't there's nothing to be worried about in the afterlife. We found that to be interesting.
Yeah, so this problem of death appears really twice in the dialogue. The prompt at issue here is where Socrates poses an argument at the close of the dialogue. But now, and this doesn't have to be from room 1, but can anyone briefly express what Socrates' argument is in terms of why he concludes that death is nothing to be feared. And a part of that argument and its conclusion is such that death, although clearly terrible, nobody really wants to die. Well, at least most people don't want to die. He thinks it's not the worst thing. And in fact, it could be a good. But does anyone remember what his argument is there?
So I think kind of what he's saying is that to be afraid of death is to assume that death is going to be a bad thing, and to assume that you know what's going to happen and that no one really knows, so it's not worth worrying about, was what I thought he was saying.
Good. Yeah, so you're mentioning really the first appearance of the problem or question of death before that argument, but it's connected to it, and so it's really important. And this is the sense in which fear of death, from a Socratic philosophical perspective, is evidence of the most egregious kind of ignorance. It's the kind of ignorance in which we don't understand that we're ignorant. We don't recognize that we're ignorant. So we don't know that we don't know. But we're pretending as if we know because of the assumption in terms of our disposition or attitude and orientation to the prospect of death as a possibility. We think that it's a prospect or possibility that is negative, that is bad. And that suggests that we actually know what it is, but we don't know what it is. And no one can claim to know what it is. That is, no one who is a part of the living. So to fear death then would be to manifest ignorance. And I think it was maybe Robert Running who mentioned this. I was taking a look at the discussion forum before class. Yeah, and so you didn't think it was all that persuasive. Did you want to share something about that?
I mean, I'm someone who fears death. Because I feel like someone like Socrates has lived a full life or a decently long life, and I'm just 19 and there's a lot of stuff I want to do. And also I fear how I die instead of like what's after death. So I think that my point of view is a little different than Socrates.
Yeah, so your death you think could be painful, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't want to die like slowly, like bleeding out or anything.
Yeah, and I hope that doesn't happen to you or anybody. But yeah, so we can die in a terrible way. And that brings us to another important aspect of ancient philosophical thought, in which we can understand philosophy as, and this is how the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus put it, we can understand philosophy as therapy for the soul. So thinking about death philosophically is therapeutic. You can alleviate some tension, some anxiety. But one thing that is missing from the Hellenic point of view, that is the ancient Greek philosophical point of view, that gets fleshed out and advanced through various thought experiments and concrete grappling with the problems of lived existence later on, say by existentialist philosophers in the 19th and 20th centuries, is the problem of anxiety. So, and this is why I think Socrates can just sort of, in a strangely pure sense, dismiss any kind of anxious concern with death as a non-problem. And that's because at the close of the dialogue, he presents us with a dichotomy. That is to say, two possible outcomes that might emerge from the event of one's own death. So does anyone remember what those outcomes are? So what does death mean? He thinks there are two possibilities. So this is that argument at the end.
Wasn't one of them the like eternal sleep, an unconsciousness, where he describes as, he no longer has to dream or worry about the world around him, where it's just like a one eternal, night of sleep, and it would actually be peaceful in his mind,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest is mine. And then the other one was about, well, then if I do go to, if you're spiritual and you believe in a spiritual place, then I will go to a spiritual place and I will actually be able to have intelligent conversations with people who have suffered as I have, or had died unjustly as I am. I like how he threw that out a lot. He's just like, he threw the word, unjust and wrongly death to show them that if you kill me, you're being wrong, which was pretty cool.
Good, good. Yeah, so you reminded me of a point I was trying to make a moment ago, and I lost the thread of my thought, but I was going to mention that the Greeks were very much concerned with a good death, a noble death. And from Socrates' point of view, and this is something Bobby mentioned, or Robbie, I'm sorry, Socrates was quite old at that point. He was in his 70s, so he felt that given that death was inevitable, maybe not now, it was coming pretty soon, it would be silly to sort of cry and quibble over these charges and compromise his own perspective, right? And also, so what Renee was just saying, that second horn of the dilemma, or not really dilemma, but the second option or possibility for the dichotomy is this kind of spiritual continuity in the afterlife or the underworld, in which Socrates would be able to continue his practice of bothering the shit out of people, but in this case, those who are already long dead. And so given that that's his favorite activity, hanging out around the agora and irritating people, he can continue to do that with impunity. So from that point of view, it's either that or an eternal rest, an eternal peaceful sleep, neither of which seem too terribly bad. So Karina, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that I don't really fear death, but I still think that his argument was bad, because he's saying that to be afraid of death is to assume knowledge of what death is. But I think that most fear, including the fear of death, comes from a sense of the unknown and from not knowing. And so in that sense, I think that he's right, but his argument is flawed.
Good, good. I'm really glad you mentioned that. And so that connects to the point I was making earlier about anxiety, how that seems to be missing. So these existentialist philosophers, so people like Soren Kierkegaard in Denmark in the 19th century, Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher in the 20th century, argue that anxiety, and this is really, by the way, before psychology as a discipline had focused on or turned its investigatory emphasis on something like depression or anxiety. And Kierkegaard in the 19th century really opened that up as a kind of proto psychologist. And this is before psychology was separated from other areas of academic research and clinical practice and so forth. But what is it that separates, from this point of view, anxiety from fear? So we fear death, but fear is always fear of something, some determinate object. So if you're afraid of bears, for example, and you're hiking in the forest and there's a bear, or you sense the presence of a bear, you might be terrified, but then you flee the bear's house, you go home, you leave the forest, you're no longer scared, right? Because the object that has caused your fear is now removed from your experience. Or if you're driving on the street, you're afraid of cops and there's a cop following you, you might feel some tension, but if the source of that tension is removed, the cop takes a right and you continue straight, well, the fear is gone. You're no longer experiencing it. But anxiety is a kind of generalized fear with no particular thematic object. That is to say, it's fear of no thing, nothing, nothing determinate. And in this way, if you're in the grip of anxiety, anything presents itself as anxious. And so think about death in this way. Death is not any kind of object which we as the living can encounter or experience. In fact, there's a kind of impossibility of even thinking of death as a possibility, as a living mind, right? So what is death? It is the absolute insuperable limit beyond which there is nothing. There is nothing to be thought. It is, as Heidegger puts it, the possibility of the impossibility of being. And so when we're anxious, we are put into a kind of attunement, which we typically ignore when we're busy in our everyday lives, engaged with this or that task. It puts us into a kind of attunement with nothingness, the very possibility of our not being anymore. And so that can arise in your experience in a variety of contexts that aren't so easily dispelled. And so that's where the existentialists would criticize Socrates and the flippancy of his argument here. And also this is applicable to this last year of the pandemic. Think about the sort of anxiety that we've experienced in the face of this overwhelming, seemingly endless uncertainty of what's going to happen, of what a new normal might look like. We have no idea. And think about this entity too, that we call a virus. What the hell is it? It's not exactly a living thing, but it's not dead either. It's something undead, like a zombie or a vampire suspended between these poles of life and death. And also, it's so infinitesimally small, it can't be perceived. And for that reason, it never shows up in our experience as an object of which we can be afraid. And that means it can be anywhere. So you go to the grocery store, you pick up a box of Cocoa Puffs, and perhaps that's been contaminated with the virus. So now you find yourself afraid of a box of cereal, right? So anything in the scope of anxiety can present itself as anxiety inducing, that is, as anxious. And the virus is also, at the same time that it's infinitesimally small, it is universal and global in scope, right? It's everywhere, yet nowhere. And so that just serves to exaggerate and to increase in an unending sort of way our lived concrete experience of the anxious. And this is why in the last year, many of us have come to a place where we're thinking about death quite a bit more than we previously were, because there's an important relationship there. So yeah, Renee, you're raising your hand. Did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say that I think it's interesting to compare the idea of the anxiety of death with the anxiety of the virus, because I had a thought where it's, oh, you know, there's also so little that's really known about the virus, like halfway into it or however long ago that was, like when the different symptoms started popping up, and there's so that we basically know nothing about the virus and we know nothing about death. And because the virus causes death, I think it's all, like you're saying, one and the same thing, because you don't know anything about death, you don't know anything about this virus. So it's fear of not only the unknown, but like sort of almost the unknowable.
Right. Yeah, and to reference Kierkegaard again, he said that the highest paradox of thought, and in philosophy we're dealing with thought, we're dealing with thinking, the highest paradox of thought is the desire to think the unthinkable, the desire to think that which cannot be thought. And this is the sense in which we can understand philosophy as a kind of homesickness, this urge to feel at home everywhere, yet we don't feel at home everywhere. And for that reason, it's a kind of endless pursuit. We're constantly trying to render what is incomprehensible or threatening or strange. We're constantly trying to render these phenomena familiar or comfortable or manageable, at least. And that has to take place at the level of the individual thinker. And that's also why Socrates insists on dialogue, conversation as essential, because the individual self is always the individual's own center, right? So I can't just sort of, in the stupid style of the Matrix films, like plug something into you and bring you to download or upload knowledge, right? You can only acquire knowledge through your own effort and through a kind of difficulty in each case, which has to do with your essential finitude as a human being. That is to say, You live a finite life that has a beginning and an end, and that's temporally speaking, but spatially speaking too, we can't be everywhere. We can only be somewhere. So we can't come to any determinate, comprehensive, or ultimately satisfying knowledge about the state of the world, if we understand the world to be the totality of being of which we are a part. Yet any truth that we uncover or develop about that totality of being, of reality of which we are a part, happens only through the individual, right? And so this is the sense in which truth, as we'll see from the point of view of the Greeks, the very birthplace of philosophy and of science, which developed out of philosophy, is evental. Truth is evental. Truth is something that happens, and it happens through an encounter of a thinking individual with something to be questioned. And that's why to question, to interrogate in the face of wonder or incomprehensibility is the ultimate piety of thought. It is the essence of thinking, to question. And the virus, as we've been talking about, the very portent of death too, makes us think, it makes us question, right? So in response to Socrates, we might say, well, I'm afraid of death, not because I think I know what it brings, but rather because I don't know what it brings. And it will bring perhaps the ultimate termination, that is the end of any possibility I have of knowing anything at all, right? And so that's where the anxiety comes in. Okay, so let's move to room 3. So that's Alanis, Elena, Maddie, and Michael. Does anyone want to share something that went on in your room? Maybe if you guys talked about one of the other 2 prompts.
Well, we talked about number 3 a lot in the death thing that everyone else talked about, but we also talked about number 2 and just like the fact that Socrates just really doesn't care about like how it's all going to end up after the court date, and he just wants to make his point, because most people that walk into this courtroom are just pleading and like trying to lesser their sentence, but he just wants to kind of make his like last points, and like he doesn't really care because he's so just like cocky with everything he believes.
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
That if he like pleads with them, then it kind of shows that like he's agreeing with them that he's guilty, and he doesn't want to plead with them because like in his mind he's not, you know.
Yeah, so remember he says he thinks it's impossible for a worse person to do evil to a good person, right?
Yeah.
So if he is assured in his conviction that he is doing the good, that he is doing the right, that even death won't be an evil to him.
Yeah. And he like walks in there and he's like, no, I'm going to sit here and prove everyone wrong that said all these things about me, because like in my heart, I believe I'm doing good.
Mm-hmm. But he almost, an important part of this though is he doesn't seem to think it's ultimately possible for him to get everyone to conclude with him that he was not in fact guilty of the charges of the indictment.
Yeah, because he thinks it's like bigger than everyone.
Yeah, it's a foregone conclusion. Yeah. That is to say, he enters the space of the courtroom having already been convicted.
Yeah.
Perspective. So there's nothing he can do within the short period of time he's given to defend himself, to disabuse the accusers or the jurors at large of their understanding of what he did as a philosopher. So instead, he's going to use this as an opportunity to exercise the philosophical lifestyle and to demonstrate what it means to be a philosopher. And for that reason, we're still reading about Socrates. We still care about Socrates, whereas no one even knows who Lycon, Anytus, and Meletus are, the 3 who brought the indictment, right? So this would be profoundly influential in a variety of historical epochs. And for example, the civil rights movement, influencing people like Martin Luther King Jr., who was also a philosopher in his own right. He taught political philosophy classes in Georgia, for example. And, Martin Luther King was deeply transformed in his understanding of the necessity of political and social change because of what he learned from philosophy. So he knew it was dangerous, and in fact, his efforts cost him his life, as we all know. Yet he didn't think that that was a reason to cease his activities in the pursuit of justice, which he knew to be right. And so that's precisely what we see Socrates demonstrating in the courtroom, right? Good. So what about room 4? Nancy, Patrick, and Brene Croft. Do you guys have anything to add? You want to share something?
I can speak for us. We went through all 3 of the different questions. The first one we were a little confused on because it seemed to be black and white, like the answers in the question, like he is using the oracle at Delphi to illustrate superhuman versus human knowledge, because the oracle at Delphi is in that time believed to have superhuman knowledge. And the second one, basically what we said has already been said, where he's refusing to give up because that would be admitting defeat. And the third, did I say anything on that? No, I didn't. Sorry. The third one, we all just kind of said, yeah, no, it's a good argument. I thought it was pretty persuasive because I like what he says about a convicted man arguing that he could be immortal if you just let him live, but understand that death is coming for him anyway. So I thought it was pretty persuasive because he almost puts it as like, this is an eventuality, so no matter what happens to me, I'm not worried. And I thought it was persuasive. There wasn't a ton of discussion, but that's what we got out of it.
Well, that's a good point. So we can criticize the argument as we have, but it has worth, it has strength in the sense that however anxious we might be in the face of the portent of death, it's going to happen. And that's the sense in which dealing with it, facing it head on, rather than distracting ourselves as we typically do. We typically think of death, even though abstractly or intellectually we understand that it's in store for every one of us. We always think, oh, well, it's not yet. It's an actuality, but a distant actuality. It's sometime later on. But in reality, it's not. It's a possibility, not an actuality, and it's a possibility that could befall us now at any moment. And we have no idea when it can come. And for that reason, however anxious you are about it, it's worthwhile to try to work through and take seriously in that therapeutic enterprise, the anxiety as such. So good. So last, room 5, Charles, Jody, Robbie, and Shannon. Do you guys have any last things to add here?
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that I think his argument was pretty convincing, for me at least. I mean, he puts death as this like unknown, as maybe good, instead of like an end, evil, a bad end. He says like is it good or evil? He doesn't know. And he says this thing which really I think is important, where he says a life that's unexamined is a life not worth living. And I mean, as a philosopher, he's always trying to discover more about life, learn more about life. And I think, well, death is obviously a part of life. And I think he is almost eager to die to find out what death really is.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's amazing. Great. So in the dialogue, Plato's dialogue Phaedo, which is a part of this series that includes the dialogue Apology that we read, and the Apology is the second in this series. The first is a dialogue called Euthyphro, and then after that is the Apology, and then the Crito, and then the Phaedo is the end. And in the Phaedo, we find Socrates in his cell, where at the end he's given by the jailer the hemlock, the poison to drink, and he dies. But the whole course of the dialogue Phaedo, we see Socrates engaged in a friendly final conversation with his followers and friends, trying to assuage their anxiety, their fear of death, by bringing about various arguments that would conclude in the immortality of the soul. And in that dialogue, Socrates claims that all philosophers, and this is to speak to Charles's point, all philosophers long for death. And philosophy is presented there as training for death, preparation for death. And why would philosophers desire death? Well, as Charles suggested, at the end of death, we can maybe, or at the end of life, and in that dialogue, death is defined really as the separation of the soul from the body. So when we die, what that means is the soul is released from the body. And Plato understands the body as a kind of prison that constrains the soul and prevents it from mingling with the higher truths of reality, of participating in the divine. So upon death, the soul is freed from that prison house and is able to return to the very sources of being, to the very truth of reality, which we spend a lifetime always imperfectly, always haphazardly, always with dissatisfaction in the end, trying to come to terms with this reality that we so intimately long to know. So death is the fruition or realization of that deeply human possibility. Okay, so good. Any final comments or questions? All right, so usually in this class we'll take a break in the middle, but we've had such a good conversation at this point. We've taken up a fair bit of our time, and there's some really important stuff to work through. So if it's okay with you guys, we'll skip the break just today, but we might get out just a little bit early to compensate for that. But I do like to, and so we'll keep this in mind, have a break roughly after the first hour or so. But so I'm going to share my screen and walk you through some slides to try to disclose some important, however, subtle points from the dialogue that you may have missed. And so a lot of this has to do with that first prompt, which Renee mentioned as pretty straightforward, but I don't think it is, this distinction between human and superhuman wisdom. And in fact, Socrates turns out to be the champion of human wisdom, no more, no less. And that's the kind of wisdom as a philosopher, and the kind of wisdom alone as a philosopher that he pretends to possess. That is human wisdom. And so for those, again, who have seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, this is Socrates or Socrates in that. And this is actually Plato. Socrates as a historical figure was much uglier than this actor. And I'm not being a jerk. Socrates was well aware of his physical unpleasantness. It was quite famous in the Greek-speaking world, his ugliness. And the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche actually argued that many of the problems that we suffer from because of this philosophical inheritance derives ultimately from the fact that Socrates was ugly. But we don't need to get into any of that. But we're going to talk about the apology and specifically epistemology here. So epistemology is one of these fundamental branches of philosophy that deals with knowledge. So it derives from the Greek word pistis, which can mean belief, opinion, but it really means conviction or persuasion, right? And so that's a problem that arises not directly in this dialogue, but we can connect it to other dialogues to make a profound point. So this is just some historical data about these figures when Socrates lived, and Plato, his student, his best student, who founded the academy in ancient Athens, and then taught Aristotle, who founded the second university, the Lyceum, and then Aristotle went on to train Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer most of the known world at that point in Greek history. So these are the major points or themes that we'll emphasize and stay with as we unfold the dialogue in its central philosophical import. So rhetoric versus dialectic, human versus superhuman wisdom, the philosopher as gadfly, and this is what Charles mentioned, this is really important, a passage about how the unexamined life is not worth living. So philosophy and the examined life, what that means, the true nature of expertise, perhaps we can come to some clarity about that. And we've talked already a lot about the relationship between philosophy and death today. So what is rhetoric? Well, for that, we have to turn to one of Plato's middle dialogues, the Gorgias. And this is the first place in the Western intellectual tradition where the very concept of rhetoric is first introduced in a kind of technical way. And so the language in Greek is rhetorike techne, and that literally means the rhetorical art, or the art of rhetoric. Etymologically, the word rhetoric means, prior to modifications largely imposed by Aristotle, who wrote an entire treatise, an entire philosophical text on the nature of rhetoric, and he was much more sympathetic to it as a skill than was Plato. But prior to this, so prior to even philosophy, rhetoric derives from rhetorike, means a kind of talk, a kind of discourse, but a kind of idle, free-flowing discourse, like you might think of gossip or something like that, where someone has a belief of some kind, maybe because they've read a news report, or they heard someone else talking about it, and they're convinced of some truth, and then they go and they like spread it. Say, oh, did you hear about this? And they're like spreading gossip. So that's kind of the originary source of this idea of rhetoric. But Gorgias is a famous sophist who was traveling at the time, and he visited a house in Athens. Socrates heard about this, and as was his disposition, his inclination, whenever a famous person, some great paragon of knowledge was in town, he wanted to go question him. So he goes to the house of Proclus, where Gorgias is visiting, and he asks, and he's accompanied by his friend, Chaerephon, who, by the way, is the one in the Apology who asks the oracle at Delphi about his friend Socrates. So Socrates and Chaerephon are at the house of Gorgias. And Socrates wants to know, since Gorgias claims to be an expert in rhetoric, a teacher of rhetoric, he wants to know what rhetoric is. So he asks this, and the first answer that we get is not from Gorgias, but from Gorgias's disciple, Proclus, who's like, oh, well, rhetoric is the best thing. That's what it is. And this prompts Socrates to say, well, that answer tells me that you're more trained in rhetoric than you are in dialectic, because I didn't ask you some adjective that would qualify a relationship to the object of our inquiry, rhetoric. I asked you to tell me what it is, not tell me something about it. It's not a very satisfying answer. If you see something, you have no idea what it is, what is that? And someone tells you, oh, it's great. Okay, maybe it is good, I don't know, but first I want to know what the fuck it is, right? So the next answer is, oh, this is why it's so great. It's the source of freedom for mankind, and at the same time, it is for each person the source of rule over others in one city. It is the ability to persuade judges in a law court, counselors in a council meeting, and assemblymen in an assembly, or in any other gathering that might take place. But before that answer is given, actually, Gorgias says, who's now speaking to Socrates, well, it's logos, that is to say, discourse. It's the art of logos. But Socrates says, well, don't doctors use discourse? I mean, when they're trying to communicate a diagnosis to their patient, they use language, right? Don't mathematicians, in fact? He uses the example of mathematicians. Mathematicians use language to work through their problems. So are mathematicians rhetoricians? And that's why he answers with this qualification. But then Socrates says, well, okay, it is this ability to persuade, yet doctors too use persuasion. That is to say, they want their patients to come to a place where they think the doctor knows what they're talking about and that they're willing to follow their prescription or their plan. So doctors too want to convince people, but does that mean that they're rhetoricians? And that's when he says, well, I think the effect of rhetoric is to persuade people in the kinds of mass meetings which happen in law courts and so on. And I think its province is in the domain of right and wrong. Okay, so it's specific to a kind of venue, that is a kind of social context where it's appropriate as a mode of discourse. And that context is places like the courtroom, an assembly hall, a Senate forum, or something like that. And what is it that brings all of these places together? Or also think of like a marketplace, right? So think of a courtroom, an assembly, the Senate building where deliberations are undertaken, a marketplace, or we can even think of the internet in this way as a kind of marketplace. So what is it that brings these venues or contexts together despite their differences? Does anyone have thoughts about that? So a lawyer is grandstanding in a courtroom, making a case. An advertiser in a marketplace, maybe think of like a snake oil salesman, right? Saying, oh, or like on television, those late night infomercials, right? Imagine that you're actually in that space with a bunch of other people and this person is selling something to you. Or think of like an assembly hall where there's deliberation over a particular law that's being considered. What makes these venues similar such that rhetoric is appropriate in them?
They're all very public.
Good, and sorry, who said that? I can't see.
Renee Croft.
Okay, Renee, yeah, so they're all public, right? So that's a really good start. They're all public, and Socrates is of the view that if you want to do good, if you want to do right in this world, if you want to pursue justice, he thinks, and this is part of his radical political philosophy, much more radical than Aristotle or even Plato, you have to do so as a private citizen and not in a public capacity, not that is as a politician, because his point was, if you try to do so and you fight for the right without compromise, you're going to piss a lot of people off and you're going to end up dead, right? As almost happened to him a couple times in his life prior to this trial. So it's important to distinguish the public and the private from where discourse is appropriate. So we're dealing with public spaces here, public contexts. And what else is going on in terms of these public contexts? Or think of like if you attend a rally during a presidential campaign, right? If you went to one of the spectacular Trump rallies or something like that, you could see rhetoric at work there. So what is beyond the public aspect? What else is going on here in these situations?
I think that, I mean, there's always someone in all these settings where there's someone who's trying to sell something to another person, whether it's an idea or something similar.
Yeah, so they're trying to sell something, that is to say, and we can be using this language metaphorically, So even if you're not trying to literally sell something, you're trying to push an idea or a view or an agenda which you want others, usually in these contexts, public ones, a multitude of others, a lot of people, you want them to embrace. That is to say, you want to persuade them, you want to convince them of something, and in a short amount of time, usually. So there's only so much time to be spent in a courtroom arguing a case. There's only so much time on a campaign trail for a politician to impress upon the populace that they're the right individual for the role, and so forth, right? So that's what brings these things together. And then we get to the last part. So this is where Socrates asks Gorgias, now, do you think, so persuasion, conviction, that's the goal, that's the target of rhetoric. We want to persuade people. He says, now do you think that the state of having been taught something, this is Socrates, do you think the state of having been taught something is the same as the state of having been convinced? Is learning the same as conviction or different? Gorgias replies, in my opinion, Socrates, they are different. Socrates says, yes, you're right. And here's the proof of it. You are asked, Gorgias, can conviction be either true or false? You'd answer, yes, I'm sure, yes. And you can say, instead of conviction, persuasion or belief. Can belief be true or false? Well, yes. But can knowledge be either true or false? Certainly not, Gorgias says. Obviously then, conviction and knowledge are not the same. Persuasion or belief and knowledge are not the same. So rhetoric then, now we can philosophically, that is dialectically, and we'll see what that means in a moment, trace through this process and come to terms to what rhetoric really is. And that's a metaphysical question. Metaphysics asks the nature of reality at large, or the nature of this or that existing being within the scope of that reality. In this case, we're dealing with the nature of rhetoric. So first of all, rhetoric is logos, it's discourse. But as we've seen, logos and discourse are used in a variety of contexts and points of application that aren't really at their heart rhetorical. So we have to modify that and say, okay, well, it's discourse without praxis, and praxis is the Greek word for action. So it's discourse without actually doing something. So a doctor uses discourse, a doctor uses language to tell the patient what they're suffering from and what to do about it. But then there's action involved. So the doctor will perform surgery or prescribe a medication or something. Rhetoricians don't do that. Okay, so next, it's aimed at persuasion. That's the end goal. We want to convince those that we are deploying this rhetorical enterprise towards. Okay, but even doctors want to persuade their patients. So we're really trying to determine the essential difference, that is, the limited parameters by which the rhetorical itself manifests its own being and its essence, as demarcated from anything that's not rhetoric, including the medical art, right? So then we clarify further. Rhetoric is appropriate in certain venues. And those venues, like the courtroom, like the Senate hall, like an assembly, like a political rally, like a marketplace, like television advertisements, where you're facing a multitude with a limited time. Okay, so then next we get rhetoric understood as persuasion that's independent of knowledge. And knowledge is not persuasion, not belief, not conviction, because all of those things can be of falsity, whereas knowledge is always of the truth and only of the truth. If you claim to know something and the content of that knowledge turns out to be false, well, then you didn't know it. But you could still say you believed it, but you didn't know it. So rhetoric is this persuasive linguistic enterprise that operates independently of knowledge. And that's important. So And that doesn't mean that everyone who uses rhetoric doesn't care about truth. It just means that it's secondary, right? So that's why politicians, so for example, in this last presidential election, there were a number of important issues that the various politicians would argue about to lay out their position and try to convince others of its rightness or appropriateness. And so part of this was healthcare, right? So Trump, from the very beginning, ran on, among other things, the platform of dismantling the Affordable Care Act, getting rid of Obamacare, right? So he would use this on the stump as part of his persuasive speeches. Yet, and this isn't just a dig against Trump, it could be against any politician, given that, and it's not really against, and I'll clarify that, given that we're dealing with politicians and not experts in medical knowledge. But Trump obviously doesn't know a goddamn thing about healthcare, right? So if he doesn't know anything really about it, he can't be convincing you in accordance with the truth. That is, he can't be teaching you as a politician making a speech. That's not the point of political speeches. You don't go to them to learn, right? You go to them to hear what the political figure is about and to gauge whether or not you ought to be convinced by their arguments, by their position. And it's conducted in a very finite amount of time. So a number of rhetorical strategies and tactics, which might not be very ethical, have to be put to work to achieve that end goal of conviction. In this case, independently of knowledge. And so this means, more concretely or practically, that to pursue this end, politicians have to operate on the basis of a subtle dynamic of revealing and concealing. So they can't reveal everything. So if Trump on his campaign trail was like, yeah, we're going to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, and of course, this will mean that a bunch of you are going to die. He wouldn't say that. And why not? Why wouldn't a politician say something like that?
It's unappealing.
Yeah, I mean, you could be in the audience and think, wait, I don't want to die. I don't like this. This doesn't seem right to me. So certain things have to be left out. Certain things have to be concealed in order to achieve maximal conviction, right? But not everything can be concealed. Some things have to be presented and revealed in some manner, even if opaquely or distortedly. Otherwise, the politician will appear to be completely ignorant or perhaps deliberately misleading or manipulative, right? And that would be bad for their end goal of conviction or persuasion too. So they have to carefully navigate this dynamic between revealing and concealing. So this, and think about like in advertising too, where that happens. If someone's pushing a product like a sugary soft drink or something, they're not going to say, yeah, and if you drink a bunch of this every day, you'll get diabetes. Even if that's true, it's not going to help their effort of convincing you that you ought to purchase their product and consume that beverage, right? Okay. But now, what is dialectic? So the word dialectic comes from the Greek, and we still preserve this prefix in some English language words. Dia, it means across or through. So think of dialogue, diagram, diametric. And then lectic derives from logos, the noun, which I mentioned already, as meaning word, argument, account, story, explanation, and so forth. And the verb legein, to speak. And legein, even more originally, etymologically speaking, means a kind of connective tissue, that is to say, a gathering. So in language, we are literally gathering sense. We are trying to pull together that which seems discordant or confusing. So logos is a kind of gathering of sense facilitated by language, which brings to light what was previously hidden, i.e. the truth. So we pursue the truth through language, and language can help us to arrive at that truth, to disclose and illuminate it, and give us the power to communicate it directly from one individual to another and across even millennia in the preservative capacity of written language. And so then logos, like the Greek word for pharmakon, which is the word that we built English language words like pharmacy, pharmacology, pharmaceutical, and so forth from. But the word pharmakon in the Greek means at the same time medicine and poison. And to determine which is which in any particular case, you need to read context clues, right? But the pharmakon can be both medicine, so a curative, and a poison. So language too is like this. It's ambiguous in its power. It can be put to work to reveal the truth, or to conceal it, to cover it over, to bury it through misleading accounts, misleading, deliberately obfuscating arguments. And so what is this concept of truth that we're dancing around? Well, the Greek word for truth is aletheia, which literally means unhiddenness or unconcealment. And it's made out of the negative prefix a, which as negative or privative mirrors certain prefixes we use in English like non or un or d. And then the root of the word aletheia derives from Lethe, which is one of 6 mythical rivers. And if you were to drink from this river or bathe in it, you would be thrust into a state of oblivion or forgetfulness. So darkness, you would know nothing, you would see nothing. Which means then, and this is very interesting, from the Greek point of view, more essential than the truth is the untruth. Because if truth as aletheia is uncovering, is unhiding, is revealing, then that means that there is something previously there that is obscure or hidden or covered over, that in the event of truth needs to be opened up, right? So more essential than the truth is a kind of obscurity or untruth. And this is why the truth, if it happens, it only happens through great difficulty and struggle, again, as a kind of event, which we have to continuously work at. And this stands in interesting contrast to our ordinary operative understanding of the true. So we tend to think of the truth as there, simply bare and naked, standing forth as what it is, and it's concealed after the fact by whatever source or for whatever reason. But that's not how the Greeks understood it. It's first of all hidden, and this is why the ancient philosopher Heraclitus argues provocatively that nature is a friend of hiddenness. Nature loves to hide. Nature loves to conceal itself. And that's why I say through the natural sciences, we have to work with a kind of difficulty and struggle to unpack the truth, to disclose it. And we're always wrong, right? So science is infinitely revisable. We're constantly, and we talked about this in terms of the virus. In this virus, we're learning more and more about it as the months go on. And so we can now do for dialectic what we did earlier for rhetoric. So what is dialectic? Well, it's like rhetoric, language, it's discourse, logos, and like rhetoric, it doesn't necessarily amount to any action or praxis. And it might be bent on a sort of persuasion, but it's not the kind of persuasion we find in rhetoric. It's instead a persuasion that is in fact dependent on knowledge of the truth. And knowledge, as we've seen, is always knowledge of the true. And so dialectic then, as an activity, a philosophical one, is the act of bringing out of concealment, bringing to the light of day, which was previously concealed or hidden. And that's why it's at odds with rhetoric. dialectic as a philosophy or a mode of carrying out philosophy wants to reveal everything. But as we'll see, and this speaks to the finitude of the human condition, the limits of possible human knowledge, it's an endless task. Once you reveal some kind of truth, there is at that very moment a new hidden background that's covered over. And that hidden background houses, as it were, our biases, our assumptions, our prejudices, and so forth, our anxieties, our hidden desires and fears, which politicians, advertisers, lawyers, and other such figures attack and exploit in order to keep them hidden, to get us to a point of belief or persuasion in terms of what they're pushing, right? So at a Trump rally, Trump will address his audience, depending on where he is, in a different way, depending on who he's speaking to, because he'll get a sense, and this is true for all politicians, they'll get a sense of the audience to whom they're speaking, what their backgrounds are, what their desires are, their hopes, their fears, their assumptions, if they're a rural community, an urban community, if they are of this demographic versus that demographic, and they will seize upon this hidden background in order to exploit them, in order to, rather than dialectically reveal, open up that hidden background for careful consideration, they will strive to keep it covered over and hidden, right? Does that make sense? Any questions on this so far? Or comments? So does it make sense how we have distinguished rhetoric from dialectic? So essentially, rhetoric operates only by recognizing and taking advantage of certain beliefs or assumptions or biases, whereas dialectic aims to clarify, to bring out from obscurity those very same beliefs and biases. That's what makes it precisely philosophical. Okay. So now let's really turn to the dialogue itself, the setup. So this is the beginning of it. Oh, how you felt, O men of Athens. And by the way, this translation of the text is by Benjamin Jowett, and he's not the best translator. There are many issues, and it reads like a 19th century gentleman. There are many better, more contemporary, readable translations, but this one's free, so that's why we're using it. He says, at hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell, but I know that their persuasive words almost made me forget who I was. And so think about what we were just talking about. Oblivion, forgetfulness, in its relationship to the concept of truth as aletheia. So the accusers were using language to cover over the truth, such that Socrates was almost incapable of even recognizing himself. So that's the power of language here, and the danger of language. And then he says, I'm quite a stranger to the ways of the place. And place, the Greek word for place is topos. And so we use that in English words like topography, topology, and so forth. And the word strange in Greek is atopos. So the word strange is literally out of place. So he says here, I am out of place in the courtroom. I am not at home in this venue in which rhetoric is the appropriate mode of logos or speech. And then he says, and first I have to reply to the older charges and to my first accusers, and then I will go to the later ones. So I want to ask a question. So he makes a distinction between two sets of accusers, the first and the second set. Now the second accusations are the real content of the indictment that Meletus, Lycon, and Anytus brought to the Athenian court. So why the hell would Socrates, at beginning his defense, mention other charges than the ones he's defending himself against specifically. That would be like if you were going to court to face um, unpaid, some charge of unpaid parking tickets or something, and you said to the judge, Your Honor, yeah, I have all these parking tickets and so forth. But before we get into that, I want to lay out there as well that I've also been accused of beating my wife. So I just want that to be known. Why the hell would he do this? There's something important going on philosophically here. And this is what he's talking about. So these are the accusers whom I dread, for they are the circulators of this rumor. So think of the basis of rhetoric as gossip or rumor. And their hearers are too apt to fancy that speculators of this sort do not believe in the gods. And they are many, and their charges against me are of ancient date, and they made them in days when you were impressible, in childhood and perhaps in youth, and the cause, when heard, went by default, for there was none to answer. And this is to connect to something I mentioned earlier, why Socrates so emphatically insisted on the importance of lived conversation and dialogue for philosophy, because the other has to be able to respond. The other has to be able to state their case, to participate in the event of revealing the truth. Yet, we're dealing with rhetoric here, such that those in the courtroom are already convinced that Socrates is guilty, and there's nothing he can do about it. He can only respond, as he says, by shadow boxing with them. And so there's no one to respond to. And here are those accusations. Socrates is an evildoer, a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and that he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. So what does that mean? So what's going on? This is a curious kind of charge to make against someone. So what's the problem that Socrates is a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven? So what's the problem with that aspect of his behavior?
That it might question the authority of the gods at the time.
Good. Yeah. So it's a kind of charge of atheism, which works with the meat of the indictment, given that he's charged with impiety, or a kind of atheism, you might say. But he vigorously rejects the truth of this charge because he's not engaged in metaphysical questions. And this is why Socrates is such a pivotal figure in the history of philosophy. Before Socrates was a period in the Western intellectual world that we call the pre-Socratic period. So his very name separates entire epochs of philosophical questioning. And that's because, unlike his predecessors, Socrates turned to human matters, to what it means to live a good life, to the pursuit of justice, rather than thinking about what goes on in the heavens and beneath the earth, which necessarily lies outside of the possibility of human experience and understanding. And this is what he refers to as superhuman wisdom. Those pre-Socratics who claim to know things like this operated on a kind of assumption that they could know what is unknowable for humans. And that's what Socrates resists. And what about this? He makes the worse appear the better cause. In other translations, that's described as he makes the weaker argument the stronger. And so what does that mean? That's kind of strange language, might be difficult to understand, but does anyone have a sense of what he's getting at there? Well, think about a lawyer. So think about someone who just wants to make a case. So think about the famous O.J. Simpson trial. It seems like everybody in the world knows that O.J. Simpson was guilty, yet he was exonerated in the end, because many think of strategic rhetorical trickery, manipulations on the part of his legal team, right? So the better cause in that case, given that we all seem to know the truth, would be that OJ killed his wife. But the weaker argument, or the weaker, that is the false conclusion, was given in that case through rhetorical strategy, right? So he's being accused basically of a sophist here, like the sophists who go around and say, well, we can argue any side. We can make the case for any side, irrespective of the truth, independently of the truth. But he vigorously rejects that claim as well, that charge as well, because he never claimed to teach anyone anything. He simply asked questions, right? And when you ask questions, this assumes that the questioner can answer, that the questioner can give a response. And this speaks to the essential relationship of truth to the individual who is asked the question, either by themselves or by a teacher, who in this case, like Socrates, is a teacher only in the sense of being an occasion, that is an opportunity for you as the one being questioned to articulate your own truth. That is to come to terms with your own grasp of the real, your own understanding of the world. And that's what he claims he does. So he doesn't teach any particular doctrines of thought, but rather he wants to teach you and us how to think. That is, how to participate in this dialectical philosophical enterprise of questioning. So this is what we were just talking about. He's accused of natural philosophy or metaphysics, that is to say, a kind of atheism, where he can even know the nature of the divine. He rejects that. And then he's accused of sophistry, making the weaker argument the stronger. But he says, men of Athens, because he's asked, well, if this isn't true, why have you gotten this reputation? Why have these rumors been circulating around Athens for so many decades? And he says, this reputation of mine has come of a certain sort of wisdom which I do possess. If you ask me what kind of wisdom, I reply, such wisdom as is attainable by man, that is by humans. For to that extent, I am inclined to believe that I am wise. Whereas the persons of whom I was speaking, that is the pre-Socratics, the natural philosophers, have a superhuman wisdom, which I may fail to describe because I have it not myself. And then he says, but the truth is that God only is wise. And in this oracle, so the oracle at Delphi, that story, he means to say that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He is only using my name as an illustration, as if he said, he is the wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. So the oracle at Delphi was a temple at this location, Delphi, and you can still go see the kind of ruins or ancient vestiges of this structure, where there would be a priestess housed. And in this case, a priestess of the god Apollo, who among other things was the god of light and illumination and harmony. And in some sense, you might say truth. But you would go there and ask a question to the priestess, who would then be a kind of intermediate conduit between the mortals and the divinities. And in response to your question, you would get a very mysterious answer, which would require interpretation. So it wouldn't be an obvious answer that you could just digest easily and say, okay, I get the truth. You have to work at it. So this is why in English we have an adjective called oracular. It really means mysterious because it derives from the oracle. And so he makes his interpretation of this pronouncement. So according to the oracle at Delphi, Socrates is the wisest. Socrates thinks, I'm not wise. I don't really know anything. So what could this mean? Well, his interpretation is such that it was a divine vocation, some demand on the part of the god for Socrates to go around and question the greatest pretenders to truth and wisdom, who hold important roles in Athenian society. Okay, And then the real meat of the indictment, the content of it, what he's facing in the court, the second set of accusations, that Socrates is a doer of evil and a corrupter of the youth, and he does not believe in the gods of the state and has no other, or excuse me, and has other new divinities of his own. So those are really the charges that he's facing. Let me see. So we're almost out of time, and I want to pick up on this because there are a few more important moments. We haven't really gotten to the ultimate upshot of this, but next week on Tuesday, we'll have a pretty nice segue from this dialogue. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen right now because we're almost out of time. But we'll have a nice segue from this dialogue to a contemporary one written by John Perry, an American philosopher in the 1970s. But this might give you the false impression that all philosophy is written in dialogues. It's not. I'm just getting us started with that. And so we'll really turn to the question of personal identity next week with John Perry's dialogue. But we'll take a little bit of time, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes at most at the beginning of class to work through the rest of this, where we're trying to gain some clarity on the nature of philosophy as the greatest kind of human wisdom and what Socrates means by that, coming to terms with our limitations, with our finitude, with our essential ignorance. And so there are some really important further points to make about that, which we'll draw out at the beginning of class next time. So are there any final comments or questions before we go? No? All right, so just a reminder, you've got the engaged reading assignments through the annotation, so that's due this week for the Plato reading along with the discussion forum contribution, so just keep that in mind. And then for next week on Tuesday, we'll finish this up and we'll start with John Perry's dialogue. We'll start asking questions about selfhood and identity. All right, so I hope you guys have a good weekend and I'll see you on Tuesday. And feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions or issues. Bye.
Thank you.
See ya.